On part 2 of our lesson on factoring expressions from lesson 3.5. So we are now moving on page 163, again, if you want to follow along in your book, factoring algebraic expressions with negative terms. So you look at this one. This is negative x minus 2. And you're like, how am I going to factor that? Because I remember Mrs. Sayward saying the first step was to identify a greatest common factor to be put outside of the parentheses. So it may help in the beginning, just as you're getting familiar with this. When you see a negative with just a variable, you know the coefficient is actually 1, right? Negative 1x is the same as saying negative x minus 2. So I'm looking at what could be the greatest common factor of 1 and of 2. Well, the greatest common factor of 1 and 2 is 1. So we agree with that. We've got the greatest common factor of 1 is 1, and of 1 and 2, 1 would work for this one as well. So again, I had said not to put negatives outside of the parentheses, but I'm going to stand corrected, because in this example, if we are going to pull out 1, we could say 1 times, I'm going to show it to you both ways, essentially, with a positive out here and a negative out here. So 1 times, I'm going to divide. Remember that trick I just showed you in the last video, kind of dividing by the number you put outside of the parentheses? Negative 1 divided by 1 would be a negative, right? So I'm back to negative x. And then negative 2 divided by positive 1 is negative 2. So I, in essence, haven't really, if I double check this, 1 times negative x is negative x, and 1, positive 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. So I'm back to what I had in the beginning. That is an equivalent expression, right? This was where we were in the beginning. Negative x minus 2. But they're saying really to properly factor it, what they're wanting you to do is to still pull out this negative, to pull out the 1, but they actually want you to pull it out as a negative 1. So if I pull out negative 1, okay, because I'm still using my greatest common factor, but now I pulled out a negative 1. Negative 1, I'm going to divide by negative 1 here. Negative x divided by negative 1 is, negative divided by a negative is a positive. And then 1 divided by 1 is 1, and we've got our x there. So negative divided by a negative is a positive. We've got negative 2 divided by negative 1. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. And 2 divided by 1 is 2. So really mathematically how this would be written, and some of you have already we've seen this before, is negative x plus 2. And remember when I think we saw it 2 lessons ago, I had explained to you, this is like saying the opposite of. Remember that negative sign is like saying the opposite of. Well, what is the opposite of x plus 2, or if I'm going to distribute a negative 1 here? Negative 1 times positive x is negative x. Negative 1 times positive 2 is negative 2, because a negative times a positive is a negative. 1 times 2 is 2. And I'm back to negative x minus 2, which is where I started up here. Negative x minus 2. So really when you have an example like this, what they're looking for you, and when you factor it, is to represent it as negative and then x plus 2. They essentially want you to write it as the opposite here by pulling out a negative 1 here, but big boy, big girl algebraic writing is you wouldn't put negative 1 here, but you have to understand that is a negative 1. you would just write it that way. Let's try another one over here. So the GCF of negative, I'm down a marker. So here, remember, first step when we're factoring is to talk about what that GCF is going to be. So do we have a greatest common factor between 3 and 5? Greatest common factor for 3 and 5. Well, 1 times 3 is 3. 1 times 5 is 5. So I have 1. But like we've seen with this one, they're actually going to have, when it is 1 and you're dealing with negatives, you're going to pull it outside of the parentheses and just write it with a negative sign, because again, that means opposite. So I can go through and divide this by a negative 1 and divide this by a negative 1, right? Because that's essentially what I'm doing by pulling this out. Negative 3 divided by negative 1 is going to be positive, right? 3 divided by 1 is 3, and then we've got our variable x. Negative 5 divided by negative 1, negative divided by negative is positive. 5 divided by 1 is 5. So is this the opposite? I'm going to erase that for a moment so we can go back to the original. Now that I pulled the negative sign outside of the parentheses, this is the opposite of 3x plus 5. Well, the opposite of 3x plus 5 is negative 3x minus 5, okay? So this is a properly factored expression when we pulled out negative 1. And I could, again, double check this by expanding or distributing. And we know we've got this invisible kind of 1 here. Negative 1 times positive 3x is negative 3x. Negative 1 times positive 5 is negative 5. Are we back up to that original expression, negative 3x minus 5? We are. So we know that we have factored it correctly. All right, we got another one like this. Negative 2x minus 3. So again, you know GCF. Right now, the common GCF for these, greatest common factor, is going to be 1. But I told you to factor it properly, you're going to pull it out as a negative 1. But we just write it as a negative sign outside of the parentheses because it means the opposite of. What is the opposite? Or I could say, I'll walk you through this. This is like having a negative 1. This is like dividing, right, by negative 1 because it's the opposite of multiplication. Negative 2x divided by negative 1 is positive 2x. Negative divided by negative is a positive. Negative 3 divided by negative 1, negative 3 divided by negative 1, negative divided by negative is a positive, positive 3x. I'm going to get rid of that little 1 because I don't need it right now. Negative 1 times 2x is negative 2x. Negative 1 times positive 3 is negative 3. Or the opposite of 2x plus 3 is negative 2x minus 3. So we now have equivalent expressions. Last one, this one, finally we get to where they do have a greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor for negative 4 minus 8. Negative 4 minus 8. So what's our GCF for negative 4 minus 8? So hopefully you're saying to yourself, well, factors of 1 and 4, 2 times 2, 1 and 8, 4 and 2. Oh, all right, 4. So I'm going to use the greatest common factor of 4. And I see I've got some negatives here, so I'm going to pull out a negative 4. And I'm going to now divide these by a negative. Now, if I had all positives, I wouldn't pull it out as a negative. If it was all addition, then I would not pull this out as a negative number. But because we have negatives, we're going to pull them out as a negative number. Negative 4A divided by negative 4. Well, a negative divided by a negative, of course, we know is a positive. 4 divided by 4 is 1, and then I bring along my A. But you know, do I need my positive sign right now in there? No. Do I need the number 1, coefficient of 1? No, because I just know it's A. Okay, so negative 4A divided by negative 4 is A. Negative 8 divided by negative 4, negative divided by negative is a positive. 8 divided by 4 is 2. So I have now factored negative 4A minus 8 to say negative 4 times, oh geez, why did I write A there? I'm sorry, should have written 2, right? 8, okay, sorry about that. If we were in class, you would have yelled at me and said, Mrs. Hayward, you wrote that incorrectly, but I don't have the benefit of having you guys telling me when I make silly mistakes. But I was checking that I did it correctly by expanding, since that's the opposite, right? Factoring is the opposite of expanding. Now I'm going to check my factoring by expanding to see if I did it correctly. So negative 4 times positive A, negative times a positive is a negative. Negative 4 times positive 2 is negative 8. Why am I writing it? Is negative 8, right? Negative 4 times positive 2 is negative 8. Is negative 4A minus 8 what I started out with? Yes, so I know that I factored this correctly. All right, now you're going to try some Edpuzzle questions on your own. Bye.